A homeless man walks into a fancy restaurant, only to be thrown out by the manager. But when a stranger speaks up, the entire room freezes and secrets long buried begin to surface. The afternoon sun spilled generously over the city, turning every glass window and metal railing into a mirror of gold. The sidewalk shimmered in the warmth, where people moved with purpose, some strolling leisurely with shopping bags, others hurrying back to offices after a late lunch. The rhythm of the day pulsed steadily, the city alive with noise and movement. Inside a popular downtown restaurant, the world felt both sheltered and vibrant. The door opened and closed in steady intervals, as waiters wove between tables, balancing trays heavy with steaming plates. Silverware clinked against porcelain. Soft laughter and casual chatter rose in overlapping waves, and the faint hum of music drifted from a hidden speaker. The scent of fresh bread, butter melting into its crust, mingled with the aroma of roasted herbs and sizzling meat. It was a place of comfort, a pocket of warmth where the chaos of the city seemed to pause. Replaced by the intimacy of shared meals, sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows, painting the wooden floors with long strips of amber light. Children's giggles rang from a corner booth as their parents tried to coax them to eat vegetables. A young couple leaned close across a small table, whispering to each other as though the rest of the world had fallen away. At another table, a group of colleagues in crisp suits clinked glasses, celebrating what seemed to be a victory at work. Everything moved with an easy rhythm, a routine of joy, comfort, and normality. Then, the door creaked open. The sound was unremarkable, but it carried a strange weight, enough to draw subtle glances from those seated closest. A man stepped inside slowly, cautiously, as though the threshold itself was a barrier he wasn't sure he had the right to cross. He was black, perhaps in his 40s, his frame lean but strong beneath layers of worn clothing. His jacket was frayed at the cuffs, the fabric dull with years of use. His shoes bore the uneven marks of too many miles walked without relief. Yet, despite the wear of his clothing, his posture carried something unexpected: dignity. His back was straight, his head held carefully, not in arrogance, but in a quiet refusal to collapse into despair. His eyes, deep and dark, scanned the room, not with greed, but with hesitation, a searching hope tangled with fear. The golden light from the windows brushed against his face, revealing lines etched not only by time but by hardship. There was exhaustion in the slump of his shoulders, the heaviness of someone who had been fighting unseen battles for far too long. Still, beneath the fatigue, there was something unbroken. His presence seemed both fragile and commanding, like a candle struggling against the wind yet still refusing to go out. For a moment, the restaurant continued as it always did. The clinking of cutlery resumed, laughter bubbled again, conversations carried on, but a ripple of awareness lingered. The man stood near the entrance, uncertain of his place in the room, and the room, in turn, seemed uncertain of him. Some diners glanced at him quickly, curiosity flickering across their faces before they turned back to their plates, unwilling to linger on what his presence suggested. Others did not look at all, choosing instead to lower their eyes, retreating into the safety of indifference. The air shifted in an almost imperceptible way, the warmth of routine touched by a chill of discomfort. The man's hands moved nervously at his sides, one thumb rubbing against the edge of his palm as though to ground himself. He took a tentative step forward, his shoes pressing softly against the polished floor. He didn't speak, not yet. His presence alone was enough to raise silent questions in the room. What did he want? Why was he here? Would he ask for something, or simply stand and remind them all of the world outside their comfortable meals? The restaurant, so full of easy joy only moments before, now held a different energy. The golden light through the windows still shone, but it seemed to frame him in contrast, his weathered clothing against polished tables, his worn shoes against the gleam of marble tile, his tired face against the laughter of those untouched by hunger. Yet even as uncertainty settled in the air, the man did not shrink. His exhaustion was undeniable, but so was his dignity. He stood in the doorway like someone balancing on the edge of two worlds, one of warmth and abundance, the other of struggle and cold streets. And in that fragile pause, before anyone moved or spoke, the moment felt like it could tip either way, toward rejection or toward compassion, toward silence or toward acknowledgement. The afternoon sun, still pouring generously through the windows, seemed to wait with him, as though holding its breath for what would come next. For a brief moment, nothing happened. The man lingered near the counter, his presence almost blending into the hum of activity, as though he were just another customer deciding what to order. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, hesitant, caught between the need for courage and the fear of rejection. His eyes darted toward the chalkboard menu above the counter, lingering not on the words, but on the possibility of being allowed to stand there, to belong even for a moment. But belonging has a way of being tested. From across the room, the restaurant manager noticed him. The manager's sharp eyes swept over the man, and his face hardened with suspicion. His frown deepened into something colder, his jaw set with quiet irritation. Without hesitation, he abandoned the conversation he had been having with a waitress and strode forward with brisk, deliberate steps. The chatter of the restaurant continued, though it seemed to dim, as though anticipation hung invisibly in the air. The manager's polished shoes struck the wooden floor with finality, each step carrying an unspoken verdict. When he stopped, just inches away from the man, silence cracked open. The manager's voice cut through the air, loud enough to pierce every conversation, sharp enough to slice through the gentle atmosphere that had filled the room only moments before. "This isn't a shelter," he said, his words laced with disdain. "You need to leave." The sentence fell heavy, like a stone dropped into still water. All at once, conversations faltered. Forks hovered mid-air, spoons rested untouched above bowls, glasses stopped short of lips. The laughter that had bounced so freely moments ago was swallowed into uneasy silence. Diners shifted in their seats, caught between the urge to look and the guilt of being caught looking. Some raised their eyes just long enough to register the scene before quickly lowering them, pretending to study their plates as if the food before them was suddenly the most fascinating thing in the world. The man stood still, shoulders tightening at the sound of those words. He lowered his gaze, no longer daring to meet anyone's eyes. His lips parted slightly, and when he spoke, his voice was little more than a whisper, fragile, almost carried away by the air itself. "I'm sorry." The apology seemed misplaced, unnecessary, but it was the instinct of someone used to being pushed away, used to shrinking himself to soften the blows of rejection. His hands curled loosely at his sides, not in defiance, but in a quiet attempt to anchor himself against the rising tide of humiliation. Around him, the silence grew heavier. A few customers shifted uncomfortably, fidgeting with napkins or tapping the edges of their glasses as though trying to release their unease without drawing attention. Others stared fixedly at the man, eyes filled with judgment or pity, or something more complicated they could not name. The manager did not soften. His frown deepened, his chin lifted with an air of authority. He made no move to hide his disdain, no effort to temper his tone. The man's presence to him was an intrusion, a stain on the polished veneer of his restaurant. Slowly, the man turned. Each movement carried a weight, as if invisible chains dragged behind him. His steps were hesitant, heavy not because of his body, but because of the weight of countless other moments, like this one moment of being told he did not belong, of being reminded that the world had little space for him. The door that had welcomed him just minutes before now loomed like a gate shutting him out. His eyes remained fixed on the ground, unwilling to risk meeting the gaze of strangers who might see too much in his face. The shame, the hunger, the quiet ache of dignity bruised once again, and still no one moved. The restaurant, once full of warmth and golden light, now felt colder, tighter. The smell of bread and roasted herbs no longer seemed inviting but suffocating. The hum of background music felt distant, irrelevant against the pounding silence of 100 unsaid words. In that suspended moment, the restaurant became a stage. Every diner was a witness, every glance or averted eye a silent verdict. No one spoke. No one stopped the man. It was easier, after all, to pretend. Easier to convince oneself that it wasn't their business, that they were powerless, that the moment would pass if they simply looked away. And so, with his whispered apology hanging in the air, the man continued his slow walk toward the door, his back hunched slightly, his presence shrinking with each step. His hand lifted, trembling faintly, reaching for the door handle. The golden sunlight beyond the glass still shone as brightly as before, but to him, it seemed far away, another world, separate and unreachable. The door, once an opening to possibility, now promised only the familiar sting of the street, the unforgiving rhythm of footsteps with nowhere to go. Inside the restaurant, the silence deepened, heavy with the unspoken truth that kindness had been demanded, but not given. That compassion had been called for, but withheld. And as the man's fingers curled around the cold metal handle, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for him to disappear back into the world no one wanted to see. The man's hand gripped the cold door handle, his fingers curled around it, as though bracing for the final push back into the world that had already rejected him countless times. His shoulders sagged beneath invisible weight, his apology still echoing in the silence that no one dared to break. And then, cutting through that heavy quiet like a clear bell, came a voice. "Wait, he stays." The words were calm but firm, spoken with a certainty that carried across the entire room. Every head lifted. Forks that had hovered midair dropped softly onto plates. A ripple of surprise moved through the restaurant as though someone had opened a window, letting in a sudden gust of air. The man froze, his hand still on the door. Slowly, cautiously, he turned his head. Near the tall windows where the golden afternoon light poured in, a man rose from his seat. He was dressed neatly, a collared shirt tucked into pressed trousers, but nothing extravagant. His clothing did not shout wealth or power, yet something in the way he stood straight-backed, steady, unhurried radiated authority. It was not the authority of arrogance, but of quiet conviction, the kind that does not need to raise its voice to command. Attention, the restaurant stilled around him. The manager, caught off guard, blinked in surprise before his features hardened. He stiffened, squaring his shoulders like a soldier confronted. "Sir," the manager began, his tone clipped, "this establishment has rules, we can't, but—" The stranger did not let him finish. With deliberate ease, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a leather wallet, and placed it on the table he had just risen from. His voice remained steady, unwavering. "Bring him a meal," the stranger said. "The bill is on me." The words rang out not as a request, but as a statement, a line drawn firmly in the sand. The silence in the restaurant deepened, but its texture had changed. What had been heavy with indifference now vibrated with tension, curiosity, and something else, something like hope. Diners exchanged glances, eyebrows raised, eyes wide. The simple act of standing, of speaking, of offering kindness in a place where none had been given, had shifted the entire balance of the room. The manager's jaw clenched. His eyes darted from the stranger to the homeless man still standing at the door, then back again. "This isn't," he tried once more, but the words faltered beneath the weight of the stranger's gaze. The homeless man, meanwhile, stood utterly still, his hand trembling against the door handle. His eyes widened, searching the stranger's face for mockery, for the familiar sting of false kindness. But all he saw was steadiness, an invitation offered without condition. His lips parted, but no words came. His throat tightened, his breath shallow. His entire body seemed caught between two instincts, to step forward into the seat being offered, or to retreat quickly into the safety of the streets where rejection was expected, almost routine. This moment felt unreal. How long had it been since someone had spoken for him rather than against him? Since a voice had cut through scorn not to push him out, but to pull him in. His hands, scarred by weather and time, trembled visibly now. He lowered them quickly, as though ashamed of his own shaking. The stranger, noticing his hesitation, softened. His tone, "Please," he said, quieter now, though no less firm. "Sit with me. No one should be turned away hungry." The golden sunlight that streamed through the windows caught the stranger's figure, casting him in warm light. He stood as though he belonged to the room in a way that could not be questioned, not because of status or wealth, but because of the calm certainty in his demeanor. The restaurant remained frozen, an audience watching a drama unfold before them. Some diners leaned forward unconsciously, their plates forgotten. A child whispered a question to his mother, but she hushed him quickly. Eyes glued to the scene. The manager exhaled sharply, his frustration visible. But in the stillness of the room, he seemed smaller now, his authority slipping from his grasp. All eyes were on the stranger, the man who had done what no one else dared to do. The homeless man finally released the door handle. His hand fell to his side, trembling still as he turned fully toward the stranger. His eyes glistened, though no tears fell. Confusion, gratitude, and disbelief warred within him, each emotion carving itself across his weary face. "Are you sure?" he asked softly, his voice hoarse. The stranger nodded once, simply. Something shifted then, the faintest crack in the wall the man had built around himself to survive years of dismissal. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he did not feel invisible. He felt seen. He took a slow step forward, then another. Each movement seemed weighted with the fear that at any second the offer would be withdrawn, that he would once again be pushed away. But the stranger remained steady, his gaze unwavering, his hand gesturing toward the empty seat across from him. When the man finally reached the table, he hesitated, hovering above the chair. His hands shook as he reached to pull it out, the simple act monumental in its significance. He sat slowly, as though lowering himself into fragile hope. The stranger returned to his seat, the wallet still resting on the table between them like a silent promise. The room remained hushed, the spell unbroken. Even the clinking of silverware had not resumed. All eyes lingered on the unlikely pair seated near the window, the glow of the afternoon sun enveloping them both. The homeless man swallowed hard, his throat tight. Words failed him. Gratitude burned in his chest, sharp and overwhelming, yet impossible to articulate. He sat trembling, unsure whether to believe what was happening, unsure whether kindness like this could truly be real. And all the while, the stranger sat calmly, as if the act he had just performed was nothing extraordinary at all. The stranger leaned slightly forward, his hand extending in a gentle gesture toward the empty chair across from him. His expression carried no judgment, no trace of pity, only calm encouragement. The homeless man hesitated, hovering awkwardly beside the table, his hands trembling at his sides. For a long moment, it seemed as if he might retreat again, vanish back into the streets where invisibility was safer than false hope. But the stranger's steady gaze anchored him. It was not the gaze of someone performing charity for spectacle. It was the gaze of someone who saw him, not the tattered clothing, not the stigma of the streets, but the man beneath. Slowly, cautiously, he lowered himself into the chair, the wooden legs scraping softly against the polished floor. As he sat, the restaurant seemed to exhale, though the silence still clung to the air. A few waiters exchanged uneasy glances, but no one moved until the stranger lifted his hand and called one over with quiet authority. His voice carried without sharpness, firm yet kind. "2 plates," he said. "Something warm and fresh bread." The waiter nodded quickly and hurried away. Around the room, Whispers began to stir like wind rustling through dry leaves. Customers leaned subtly toward one another, their eyes darting to the table by the window where the unlikely pair now sat. "Why him?" someone murmured. "What is he doing?" Another whispered back. The questions rippled from table to table, curiosity sharpening the air. Why would a man risk open confrontation with the manager? Why insist on giving a seat and a meal to someone the world had already dismissed? It was easier to pretend not to see such people, to let them drift outside the boundaries of comfort. Yet here, before their eyes, that fragile line had been broken. The homeless man sat stiffly, his hands folded tightly in his lap as if afraid to touch anything. His eyes remained lowered, flicking up only briefly to meet the stranger's gaze before darting back to the table. The weight of so many watching eyes pressed heavily on him. He had spent years being invisible, and now, suddenly, he was at the center of attention. When the plates finally arrived, the smell of roasted chicken and warm bread spread through the air, rich and comforting. The waiter set the dishes down carefully, his expression caught between confusion and reluctant respect. Man stared at the food for a moment, his breath catching in his throat. His hands twitched, reaching, then pulling back, as though afraid this was some cruel mirage that would disappear the moment he dared to believe in it. "Go ahead," the stranger said softly, his tone steady, unhurried. The man picked up the fork, his fingers trembling. The first bite was small, cautious, but as the flavors touched his tongue, his eyes closed briefly and his shoulders seemed to loosen, a fraction of the burden lifting. He ate slowly at first, savoring each bite, then with more urgency, hunger overtaking hesitation. The stranger did not interrupt. He ate alongside him, unhurried, as if this meal were the most ordinary thing in the world. Yet his eyes never wavered. From the man, watching not with pity, but with attentiveness, as though bearing witness to something important. Between bites, silence stretched, not uncomfortable, but fragile. Finally, the man set down his fork and drew in a shaky breath. His voice, when it came, was quiet, low enough that only the stranger could hear. "I wasn't always like this," he murmured, his gaze fixed on the bread he held in his hand. "I had a home once, a wife, a daughter, a job I was proud of." His words faltered, but the stranger said nothing, simply nodded, inviting him to continue. Man swallowed hard. Then everything changed. One moment, everything I loved was there. The next, it was gone, an accident. "A fire." His voice cracked, his throat tightening. He blinked rapidly, fighting the sting in his eyes. He did not go into detail. He didn't need to. The raw ache in his voice painted enough of the picture. The tragedy itself remained vague, shrouded in silence, but the hollow it left behind was unmistakable. "I tried to keep going," he continued, his voice trembling. "Tried to work, to live. But grief, it takes pieces of you. And soon, I lost the rest, the house, the job, everything." His hands clenched, knuckles white. "Now, most people don't even look at me. To them, I'm just nothing." The stranger's face did not shift into pity, nor did he rush to fill the silence with empty words. He sat with the man's story, listening as though it mattered, as though every syllable was worth holding, worth remembering. When the man finally looked up, his eyes wet and uncertain, the stranger met his gaze directly. His voice was low, but firm, steady as the earth beneath their feet. "You are not nothing," he said. The words were simple, but in their simplicity carried weight. They cut through the years of silence, through the countless dismissals, through the ache of being unseen. The man's breath hitched, his chest tightening as though the sentence itself had reached into him and steadied the fragments he carried. Around them, the whispers continued, soft currents of disbelief and curiosity. But at that table, by the window where the afternoon sun poured down like blessing, the world seemed to pause. The stranger did not treat him as an inconvenience, nor as a charity case. He treated him as a man with a story, with dignity, with worth that no tragedy and no circumstance could erase. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, the homeless man felt not like a shadow, but like someone whose existence mattered. The meal continued, bite by bite, word by word, as the mystery of both men, one stripped by tragedy, the other defined by quiet authority, slowly began to unfold. The plates between them were nearly empty now, crumbs scattered across the porcelain like remnants of a quiet battle. The restaurant still buzzed faintly with whispers, the energy of curiosity pulsing just beneath the surface. Yet at the table, by the window, time seemed slower, gentler, as though the rest of the world had stepped back to give space for this moment. The homeless man leaned back in his chair, his body loosening as warmth returned to him, not only from the food, but from the stranger's steady presence. He breathed deeply, each exhale softer than the last, like a storm within him was finally beginning to settle. For the first time in years, he felt the strength to speak words long buried. "You know," he said quietly, his gaze drifting toward the golden light that spilled across the window pane. "I used to stand in places like this, but not as a guest. I was the one behind the counter, in the kitchen, cooking." The stranger tilted his head, listening closely. His eyes held no shock, no disbelief, only patient curiosity. "I was a chef," the man continued, his voice carrying a mixture of pride and sorrow. "Not just a cook, a real chef. People came from all over to taste what I made. The kitchen, it was my world. The smells, the heat, the rhythm of knives against boards, the hiss of pans, it was music to me. And food." His throat tightened, but he pressed on. "Food was how I spoke love, for my wife, for my daughter, for every person who ever walked through those doors." His hands moved unconsciously as he spoke, fingers tracing the memory of chopping, stirring, seasoning. "I believed in it. That a meal wasn't just food, but a way to give people comfort, joy, even hope, and I was good at it, damn good." A flicker of his old fire sparked briefly in his eyes, a shadow of the man he once had been. The stranger's lips curved into a faint smile, but he said nothing, letting the silence honor the weight of the revelation. The man's gaze lowered, his expression clouding again. "But tragedy doesn't care how skilled your hands are. One fire, one accident, can burn down everything. My family was gone in a night. My home followed soon after, and the kitchen." His voice broke slightly. He pressed a hand to his, eyes shaking his head. "I never stepped foot in one again. Not until now. Not like this." The stranger studied him quietly, his expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, he leaned forward. His voice, though soft, carried through the silence of the room. "You were not just a chef," he said slowly. "You were the chef." The homeless man blinked, startled. "What do you mean?" The stranger's eyes held his firmly, and for the first time since their meeting, the faintest spark of authority sharpened his tone. "I know your name. I know your work, in fact." He straightened slightly, his gaze sweeping briefly across the restaurant before returning. "This very place, this restaurant, thrived because of you. These walls once echoed with your recipes, your passion, your fire. And the dishes people still order today?" He gestured toward the menu board. "They carry your fingerprints." A stunned silence fell over the table, then spilled outward. The nearby customers, already leaning in to catch fragments of conversation, gasped audibly. Words spread quickly across the room like wildfire. "A chef? This man? Here?" The homeless man's breath caught in his chest. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again, but no sound came. His eyes darted toward the menu on the wall, then down at the half-eaten bread on his plate. Recognition dawned slowly, painfully, as if he were seeing his past life hidden in plain sight. "How could you possibly?" he began. But the stranger lifted a hand gently, cutting him off. "Because," the stranger said evenly, "I am the new owner of this restaurant." The words landed like thunder in the room. Gasps echoed, chairs creaked as diners leaned closer, unable to contain their astonishment. The waiter by the counter froze mid-step. Even the background music seemed to fade, drowned out by the collective disbelief. The homeless man sat frozen, his body rigid, his eyes wide. For a long moment, he could do nothing but stare. The stranger continued, his voice calm but resolute. "When I bought this place, I studied its history. I learned who built its reputation, who crafted the dishes people loved, who gave it a soul, and every path led back to you. This was once your home, your creation, and now—" He paused, his expression softening. "You've been turned away from it like a stranger." At the far side of the room, the manager paled. Realization struck him with the weight of a hammer. His eyes darted nervously between the stranger and the homeless man, his earlier arrogance draining into panic. He had humiliated not just any man, but the very architect of the restaurant's legacy, the chef, whose recipes had lined their pockets and filled their seats. The truth reframed everything. This wasn't charity. This wasn't a mere act of kindness. It was recognition. A reunion of past and present, justice twisting back into place after years of fracture. The diners who had averted their eyes earlier now stared openly, faces lit with awe, some with guilt. They had witnessed a man dismissed as nothing, only to learn he had once been the very heart of the place they enjoyed. The homeless man sat silently, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. The revelation wrapped around him like a storm, part disbelief, part shame, part fragile, rising hope. The stranger did not rush him. He simply sat steady, a quiet anchor in the flood of gasps and whispers, and in that silence, one truth rang. Louder than all the noise, this man was not forgotten. He was not nothing. He was the chef who had built a legacy, and now, in the most unlikely way, he was sitting face to face with its future. For a moment, the restaurant held its breath. The air was thick, as if even the dust motes suspended in the shafts of golden afternoon light had paused, waiting. The stranger slowly pushed back his chair and rose to his feet. His presence filled the room, not with bluster or noise, but with a quiet authority that demanded attention. Conversations that had been reduced to murmurs now fell into complete silence. Every pair of eyes turned toward him. He let the silence linger just long enough for the weight of it to sink in. Then his voice, steady and calm, cut through the tension. "Respect," he began, his gaze sweeping across the diners, pausing briefly on the stunned manager, "should never depend on appearances." The words were simple, but they carried the resonance of something more, a truth that struck against the collective guilt of the room. He gestured toward the man seated at his table, the one whose tattered coat and weathered face had just hours ago marked him as invisible, unworthy. "This man," the stranger continued, his voice rising with quiet conviction, "is not only welcome here, he belongs here." The words seemed to ripple through the room, shifting the air itself. The diners glanced at one another, their expressions softening, their discomfort giving way to a reluctant admiration. For so long, they had looked at the homeless man with pity at best, contempt at worst. But now, under the stranger's words, they were forced to see him anew, not as an outcast, but as someone whose legacy had helped build the very place in which they sat. The homeless man looked up, his eyes wide, shimmering with a mix of disbelief and fragile hope. His trembling hands gripped the edge of the table, as if to anchor himself against the tide of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. The stranger turned fully toward him, his voice gentler now. "You gave this place its heart once. You poured your skill, your love, your soul into it. That spirit never left. It's still here, waiting for you." The homeless man shook his head slightly, almost in protest. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. I wouldn't know where to begin. It's been years, too many. I've lost everything." "No," the stranger interrupted firmly, though his tone was kind. You haven't lost everything. Not your hands, not your craft, not your dignity. Those are still yours, if you choose to claim them. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a business card, and placed it gently on the table between them. I am offering you more than a meal. I am offering you a job. A chance to cook again, to rebuild. To reclaim what was always yours. For a heartbeat, the man didn't move. His eyes flicked from the card to the stranger, then down to his own. Scarred hands, as though weighing whether he was worthy of such an offer. The room held perfectly still, as though the diners, the staff, even the walls themselves were holding vigil over the fragile moment. Then, from the corner of the room, a single pair of hands began to clap. Slowly, others joined in hesitant. At first, then stronger, until the restaurant erupted in applause. It was not the polite applause of social obligation, but something raw, something that carried relief, admiration, even repentance. The sound swelled, filling the room with thunderous affirmation that the homeless man, once invisible, once shamed, sat. At the center of it all, his chest rising and falling in ragged breaths. Tears welled in his eyes, threatening to spill, but he did not look away. He looked directly at the stranger, his voice breaking as he whispered, "Why me, after everything?" "Why?" The stranger smiled, a quiet, unwavering smile. "Because every person deserves a second chance. And because this place owes its soul to you. It's time it gave something back." The manager stood stiff near the counter, his face ashen, sweat prickling his forehead. The earlier arrogance had drained completely from him, leaving only shame. He opened his mouth, perhaps to apologize, but the sound was swallowed by the continuing applause. His authority, once unquestioned in this space, had been stripped bare in front of all. Justice was no longer his to control. The homeless man slowly rose to his feet, shaky but resolute. The applause grew louder. Some diners even stood, cheering openly now, their earlier silence replaced with visible support. For once, the spotlight was not on the stranger who had intervened, but on the man who had endured. A single tear traced down his cheek, but his lips curved upward into a trembling smile, the first genuine smile to touch his face in years. He looked at the stranger, then at the room, and finally at the menu on the wall where echoes of his recipes still lingered. "Maybe," he said softly, his voice barely carrying over the noise, but strong enough for the stranger to hear. "Maybe I can find my way back." The stranger nodded, his expression steady but filled with warmth. "Not maybe you will." The applause surged once more, a tide of redemption crashing through the restaurant. For the first time in years, the homeless man stood not as a shadow, not as an outcast, but as what he had always been, a creator, a craftsman, a man of dignity. Justice had come not through punishment, but through restoration. Redemption had arrived not with pity, but with recognition. And as the golden light of the afternoon deepened into the rich amber of evening, the restaurant pulsed with something rare and unforgettable. Hope reborn, dignity restored, and a legacy reclaimed. The clamor of applause eventually faded, though its echoes seemed to linger in the air, woven into the very walls of the restaurant. Conversation slowly returned, softer now, tinged with a reverence that hadn't existed before. What had begun as an ordinary afternoon, forks clinking, laughter drifting lazily through the warm sunlight, had transformed into something none of them would soon forget. The homeless man remained standing, his posture still tentative, but his eyes carried a spark that had not been there when he first walked through the door. The stranger beside him placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, not to lead him, not to direct him, but to stand with him as an equal. That gesture alone seemed to strip away the last fragments of shame clinging to the man's weathered frame. A moment, no one spoke. The restaurant felt like a cathedral, hushed and solemn, each person reckoning privately with what they had just witnessed. Then, quietly, the narration of the moment seemed to shift inward, as though the very air carried a reminder meant only for those present, but for anyone willing to listen. In a world quick to judge by clothing or circumstance, compassion can reveal the truth hidden beneath. The diners reflected silently, realizing how swiftly they had looked away when the man had entered, how instinctively they had distanced themselves. His tattered coat, the dirt on his hands, the weight in his step, all of it had screamed outsider to them. They had not cared to ask who he was, what he carried, or what story lay beneath the surface. Only now, after the stranger's intervention, were they confronted with the truth that greatness, dignity, and humanity often hide in the places we least expect. The manager, who had once ruled the room with brisk efficiency, stood off to the side, humbled into silence. He replayed his own words, "This isn't a shelter. You need to leave," and felt them twist in his chest like barbed wire. What he had thought was firm professionalism now sounded cruel, small, and unforgiving. He saw now that he hadn't been guarding the restaurant's order, but had been guarding his own narrow vision of worth. Every person carries a story we cannot see, and sometimes the ones we push aside hold greatness we've forgotten. The truth of that thought resonated deeply as the homeless man lowered himself slowly back into the chair. His trembling hand reached for the glass of water before him. He sipped, not with desperation, but with care, as if tasting the first drops of a life he thought he had lost forever. The people around him saw not a vagrant now, but a man who had once fed hundreds, who had poured himself into recipes that still lingered on their tongues. It was sobering, this realization. How many others walked unseen among them, dismissed, discarded, when inside they carried entire worlds of memory, love, and skill? How often had they passed by without looking, or worse, had looked only long enough to condemn? The stranger remained by the man's side, his presence steady and unwavering. He did not bask in the crowd's approval, nor did he seek to elevate himself as a hero. His actions had not been a performance, but a reminder, one that demanded they all reconsider what it meant to see another human being. The room seemed to breathe again, softer now, touched by something rare, humility. Diners leaned closer to their families. Hands found hands across tables, and eyes softened with unspoken apology. The harsh fluorescent hum of the restaurant lights seemed to dim beneath the glow of something warmer, as though compassion itself had settled over them like a blanket. Kindness does not just change lives. It restores them. The words hung invisibly in the air, framing the scene like the moral of a parable. For the homeless man, kindness had not come as pity, nor as charity, but as recognition. He had not been rescued, he had been remembered. In that moment, he was not a burden to be tolerated, but a craftsman offered the chance to stand again in the light of his own legacy. For the diners, kindness had reshaped the very room around them. Where moments before there had been tension and judgment, now there was unity, applause, and reverence. They had not only witnessed an act of grace, they had become part of it, drawn into the tide of redemption. Even the manager, his pride fractured, and his authority challenged, understood that he stood at a crossroads. The shame he felt was painful, but within it stirred the possibility of change. If he could learn from this, if he could open his eyes to those who entered not as problems, but as people, perhaps he too could begin again. The afternoon sun had shifted by then, casting deeper amber across the floor. Dust danced in the golden beams, carrying with it a quiet promise that this moment would not be lost, that its lesson would linger long after the chairs were stacked and the doors closed. The homeless man glanced once more at the card resting on the table, then at the stranger beside him. His smile, fragile yet radiant, said more than words ever could. For the first time in years, he was not invisible. He was not forgotten. He was seen, valued, restored. The stranger gave a small nod, as though affirming what had already been decided by something greater than himself. Compassion had spoken louder than rules, louder than appearances, louder than fear. And in that restaurant, on that ordinary golden afternoon, A truth revealed itself to all, that the measure of a person's worth is never found in the fabric of their clothes or the balance of their fortune, but in the story they carry and the humanity they hold. The applause might fade, the meals might end, but the memory of this day would remain. For those who witnessed it, judgment would come slower, compassion quicker. They would remember the man who walked in as a shadow and left as a reminder that kindness, when freely given, does not simply change lives, it restores them.